Thank you. Like Monique said, my name is Maura Burke, and I'm joined today by my colleague Stefan Gaillard. And of course, I just want to start by thanking Monique and the organizers for having us here and for putting together such a great program to look at how, OA can have these really practical improvements in our research practices. So I am from the Journal of Trial and Error, which is an academic journal, an OA academic journal that was founded by a group of master's students at Utrecht University a few years ago. And we specialize in the publication of negative and null results. And we have, there's a lot to say about JOTA, as we call it for short, but we're not going to go too much into detail about what JOTA does today. We will look at some of our motivations for doing what we do in the context of publishing research. But today, of course, we are going to talk about how OA, specifically and generally, can improve practices and knowledge. And we were invited to keep things kind of fun. So we'll try to walk the line between being lighthearted and also informative. So a really brief program. We're only going to be talking for about 30 minutes, 20 minutes really, with 10 minutes for questions. So first, I'm going to introduce a case study in animal research that is plucked from one of our own articles at JOTA. So a nice little bit of promotion if you want to go read the article afterwards. And then Stefan will be discussing some of the epistemic and ethical motivations for publishing research where, I don't know, maybe things didn't go exactly to plan or something unexpected arise. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So today I am introducing an aspect of this paper by Nicole Nelson. And this is a paper that we published in the first edition of IOTA. And Nelson discusses here what she calls epistemic byproducts. And she views these epistemic byproducts, which we'll define in just a few minutes, as something that could be thought of as an extension of a type of publication bias. And I'm sure we're familiar with publication bias in a more general sense, and that's what Stefan will be talking about in just a bit. But Nelson wanted to identify kind of hidden aspects of publication bias. And she does this by doing a close ethnographic study of a group of researchers, specifically a group of animal behavior researchers. Now, these researchers wanted to answer the question, what are the genetic contributors to certain behaviors like anxiety and drug addiction? And as any good scientist would do, they identified some relevant variables that were relevant to their experimental program, and then they identified some things that they would maintain control so they could hopefully get some knowledge out of these experiments. And they specifically were interested in providing mice with a whole bunch of stimuli and then identifying certain mice who were more interested in consuming, a a lot of alcohol. And then they wanted to breed these mice who voluntarily drank large quantities of alcohol and then study their genomes. Now, part of what one needs experimentally is a consistent environment, of course. We need to know what is a change maker in our experimental process. And in order to identify a change maker, we need everything else to stay consistent. Changes in the environment that the mice were living in could, of course, introduce stressors, and these stressors would affect mice behaviors in ways that the experimenters weren't interested in researching. They wanted to just look at genetic contributors. But of course, the question becomes, truthfully, how much control can we exert on our environments and our experiments? So enter a new puppy. One of the researchers in this group decided to adopt a dog. And unfortunately, there are no pictures of the puppy included in this article. But I assume it was very, very cute. And the researcher was very excited and hung out with it a lot and then got dog odor all over itself. So little did it know that this little cute puppy was going to unintentionally disrupt the research environment of its new owners. Because as we know, dogs are natural predators of mice. And as we also know, mice will change their behavior in response to odors of predator species. So, around the time that this researcher got their new dog, they started to notice that the behavioral responses of her mice were changing. She had been trying really hard to elicit some kind of strong behavioral response from the mice, and she had repeated the experiment a lot, time and time and time again. She was really struggling to get an emotive response. However, all of a sudden, her mice had strong emotive responses, and she didn't know what was happening until she realized, ah, of course, I got a new dog. But is this of course really so clear, right? I mean, it's not immediate clear that the introduction of the new odor is the response for the shift in the behavior of the mice. Because it's not like our experiments are performed in perfect isolation. Sometimes there's construction work going on outside, there are fire drills. Maybe you've got some new policy changes. You need to change your bedding for your mice. You might even run into the situation where you have some pesky colleagues who like to listen to really loud music or yell across the room to their other colleagues. And all of these elements can have an impact on our experimental procedures. And of course, we understand that to be the case. But how do we go about sharing this knowledge? In Nelson's work, she argued that a lot of the time this knowledge that these researchers had gained about the environment of the mice, like for instance, their response to the odor of the dog, never really made it into publications themselves. You know, these authors were interested in the genetic contributors to behavior, not environmental, and thus the publications that they made reflected this bias. So whenever these bits of knowledge about yeah, the impact of loud music or the impact of a new dog were shared with others in their field, they were shared in casual conversations or, water cooler talk, as we call it a lot at Yota, sometimes in kind of hushed tones when they're talking about a colleague who might be yelling in the laboratory more than they ought to. And Nicole Nelson likes to describe these antecedent bits of knowledge production as the following: that their knowledge about environmental factors in this setting was like the sawdust produced in the process of building a piece of furniture. It's a byproduct of constructing the desired object. However, Nelson argues, and I maintain the same, that these epistemic byproducts can be valuable in of themselves and ought to be shared or published. And Nicole gives us some reasons to do this. She argues first that these bits of information, these epistemic byproducts, can play an important role in robust replication attempts. Second, their absence can result in misplaced scientific certainty. And third, because they contribute to a holistic understanding of natural phenomena. So while it might feel kind of funny to include a discussion of the adoption of your new dog in a research paper, if it is relevant, if you can identify a concrete effect of this new dog in your research, it should absolutely be included. And now I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague Stefan, who is going to explain more in depth the motivations for sharing all of our research products within the context of some of the issues that we often experience in research. So I will stop sharing here and Stefan can begin to share.
you, Maura. So my name is Stefan Gaillard, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Journal of Trial and Error. And the idea for JOTA actually arose. Can you see my slides?
I cannot.
Oh.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So the idea for the journal actually arose after a lecture on open science and open access. And we were all of the co-founders were struck by the fact that even if everything that you publish is accessible, that still leaves a large portion of research that's never published at all, and thus cannot be made open access because it's not there to begin with. And that's usually negative results or null results. So that's how the idea for the journal arose. But why would you publish your negative results? So I'm going to tackle here some epistemological concerns. So how do we gain knowledge in science, and some ethical concerns. Why should we feel obligated to share our negative results? So first, replication, meta-analysis, and lines of inquiry, 3 epistemological concerns related to negative results. So I'm assuming that most people here will be familiar with the so-called replication crisis, where a lot of studies in social sciences, but also biomedical sciences, and also more and more in fields like nanoscience, are failing to replicate. So how is this related to positive publication bias? So if you have a large original cohort of studies that you conduct, and you only publish the positive results, there will have been a lot of studies that you did that had negative or null results that you never publish about. And then if you years later, you do another large cohort of studies where you try to replicate certain theories, certain facts, then you will have these negative and null results again. But it will look like there are more of them than you expected because you were unfamiliar with the negative results of the original studies. And this relates to meta-analysis. So if you want to know, for example, whether certain medicine A or certain medicine B is more effective, you would do a lot of studies on that. And then you would compare all those studies to get a conclusion. So you would do 100 studies for medicine A, 100 studies for medicine B, and then see in how many cases the medicine was effective, for example. But this meta-analysis becomes biased if it can only look into research about positive results. So if medicine worked in 70 of the 100 studies, but only those 70 studies where it worked are published, then it looks like the medicine worked in all cases, whereas that's clearly not the case. But also, positive and negative results can influence lines of inquiry. If you knew that a certain certain method doesn't work, then why would you try it again, right? I mean, of course, you want to make sure that it actually doesn't work. You have to do your due diligence. But if you're quite sure after a couple of studies that a new method doesn't work, it would be far more beneficial for the progress of science to look into other lines of inquiry. But you only know that if you know that a certain method doesn't work. So, for example, we gave a talk in Cambridge, and a PhD student came up to us and she said, I had this problem where I tried this new method for months during my PhD, and it didn't work. And I presented it at a conference, and people there told me, oh, but we already know that this method doesn't work. Why did you try it? And she said, I couldn't find any published literature on this method that it doesn't work. And the people there said, yeah, of course, we didn't publish about it, but it's sort of a well-known secret in the community. But that's again, clearly not always the case, right? So if you're not part of that tight-knit community, or you just happen to not know the right people, then you don't know whether a method works or not unless you can find evidence of it online, for example, in open access articles. So why are these potential lines of increase important? On the one hand, because it relates to, as I said, the advancements of knowledge, but it can also relate to harm reduction. And besides that, other ethical concerns for publishing negative results might be efficiency and the integrity of science. So first, reducing harm potential. I think this quote summarizes it very well. For negative trials, there is scientific value, and I would say ethical value, in ruling out experimental agents or hypotheses from further consideration, which can produce social value by reducing the number of participants exposed to harmful or ineffective interventions and redirecting research resources toward more promising lines of research. So the first part, for animal studies, if you're investigating a method that will turn out not to work, in the process, you will probably do harm to your animal participants, or participants maybe not the right word, but to the animals you use during your research. And if this could have been prevented because the knowledge that this method doesn't work is already there, then in a way you've done harm to those animals that shouldn't have occurred at all. So the more you publish your negative results, the less harm in the long run we would expect to be done to animals during animal research, for example. And the second part of the sentence, so the redirecting research resources, brings me to the efficiency, right? So there's a limited amount of money and there's a limited amount of time. And we should be expected to use that limited amount of money and limited amount of time efficiently, right? The amount of money, especially because, for example, most research is funded through taxpayer money. So we get taxpayer money, and the taxpayers could reasonably expect that we make efficient use of that money to do research that in the long run will hopefully be, again, beneficial for society. But also, for example, towards early career researchers, do we not have a duty towards them to make sure that they're using their time efficiently, right? PhDs and early career researchers, all the way up to professors, are already overworked, overstressed. There are high dropout rates in PhD tracks. And why would you make that worse by doing inefficient research, which is what not publishing negative results ultimately boils down to? And maybe on a slightly higher level, the more lofty ideal, why did we all get into science? We got into science because we either wanted to help people, or we just love science in itself. We love the puzzles, we love gaining new forms of knowledge. For whatever reason you got into science, I think publishing about your struggles, publishing about negative results should be an integral part of that. Whether it's for helping society, as I already explained, publishing those negative results is beneficial for society, or whether it's about gaining truth, gaining knowledge. So knowing what does not work is also a form of knowledge. So I think the role of failure in science has been neglected for the past years way too much, been shoved under the rug, and it's time that everyone that is concerned about the integrity of science, how we do science, should work towards making failure more accessible again. And part of that is publishing open access about your failures or null results or whatever you want to call it. Thank you very much.